Well, gosh, thank you. I think it's really generous to call me an expert in Curtis. The fact that the Dubuque Museum or Dubuque Duma, do you refer to it as Duma?
One's fine, yeah.
All right. This is a really remarkable place in terms of Curtis. I think that how many exhibitions has it been? I looked a little bit on your website to kind of get a sense of how much Curtis work you've done. There are 8 solo Curtis shows since 2004. 2 two-person shows, one with someone of no less talent than Thomas Moran. And I think that Mark James would probably be thrilled to, as he was and is, I'm sure, to be in league with Thomas Moran and Curtis in this space. Boy, there's so many directions I could take. My interest in Curtis is part of a larger commitment to photographic history. Curtis certainly is one of the most outstanding figures of 20th century photography, 20th century representation, speaking even more broadly. His record of North American Indian life and customs, and as you all have seen, decorative arts, landscape, the whole package of Curtis's work is a remarkable capsule of American history and American time. So for me to call myself an expert is almost an insult to you all, because you have had so much opportunity to see Curtis work over the past decade. So it's a real thrill for me to be here. And I would really like to be able to say thank you to a bunch of people, but I think I'll save most of those comments until the end. You know how people will say, "Stop me if you've heard this before"? If I cover ground that you've heard before, you can let me know. You can say, "Okay, move forward." Next slide. Keep moving. Yes, thank you. We know all of this already. But I'll try and give you some of my own thoughts about Curtis in general, and Curtis in conjunction with Mark James, and Curtis as a representation of what I like to see as photography's intimate relationship with anachronism and with the motion of time. All right, David. Anachronism defined above or on the screen for you, something or someone that is not in its correct historical or chronological time, especially a thing or person that belongs to an earlier time. As I always came to understand anachronism was a mistake in time or place. Photography, because it's able to package a little slice of time and move it around, is, to my mind, inherently anachronistic. And it's one of the things that I find most intriguing about studying photography, is that I can have the impression that I'm looking at a particular moment in time and suddenly realizing that this is a picture that was made much earlier, much later, in a different place. Photography has this ability to move you in ways that other mediums don't. One of the essential questions asked about photography these days. I'm sure you're all aware of this thing called image manipulation software, sometimes called Photoshop. A product of the digital age, product of the opportunity to have a photograph that has been transformed into bits and bytes of data, having been transformed from something physical into something electronic. So it's difficult to say these days that photography equals truth. It's been a fairly common notion over time that photographs don't lie. We want to believe that photographs show us the truth, or at least a truth. Unfortunately, photographic truth is fairly elusive. The fact that the camera is a physical presence in a moment is still no guarantee that photographs of that moment will reliably narrate what was going on. In the courts today, the question of first-person eyewitness testimony even is becoming an issue. And in light of that, this objective medium of photography, in which nature draws herself with light, is becoming increasingly suspect. So, if nothing else today, I'd like you all to come away from the talk with a bit of, shall I say, enlightened cynicism about photography and its relationship to truth. I'd like that, thank you. Please be cynical about photography. Photographic images are very sly, the way they talk to us about history. They tell us stories that are really more fictive than factual. And all of this is a metaphor for the challenges of relating history. And I think that, that Curtis's photographs and James's photographs in the dialogue that they're having upstairs is quite exemplary. What is the West? How do you picture it? How do you picture it? Sorry?
It's burnt.
It's burnt right now. I know, it's very smoky. That's one way of picturing it, a very current way. But of course, there have been fires in the West forever. It's a huge, huge area, obviously. And one of the things that interests me in this talk is thinking about photographers and where they come from. I have a kind of long-standing commitment to character of an artist as representative of a place. And as I look at Edward Curtis and Mark James, I'm really impressed to realize that they represent an almost unbroken span of time from Curtis's birth in 1868 to his death in 1954, and Mark James born in 1955 to today. It's almost as if a kind of a torch was passed in that mid-50s era. Though I guess it wouldn't have been very much of an event for the infant Mark James to encounter Curtis, had that been possible. But the idea that the West is an area. Is it an area? Is it a state of mind? Is it a thesis? All of these things, I think, are packaged up in artists and individuals in general, but artists have demonstrated a talent for depicting the West. And I'm looking around at some of the representations here, and I'm trying to get myself situated here in Dubuque. Because we have the Mississippi running through the town, I'm thinking, is this really the West? We're only about a third of the way across the country, probably 2,000 miles to the west of us. So somewhere along the line, there's a David?
Key City.
Key City, is that the West?
Nickname for Dubuque.
Okay.
From westward kind of expansion and that idea, so you're...
Yep, I'm on point.
Yes, you are.
I had not heard that before. I do like the other nickname that I see on the Chamber of Commerce sign as I come into town, which says the masterpiece on the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Although I think you may have stolen that title from my hometown up north, St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul, I've always thought of in sort of provincial terms as the last city of the East. And Minneapolis, that milling city just on the other side of the river from us, is the first city of the West. That's how we up north think about these things. So I'm not sure, and David, you were kind enough to refer to me as having lived or grown up in Minneapolis and St. Paul, because I really am both. I like to think of myself as a twin citizen, having a notion of life on both sides of the river. Getting distracted here. Curtis, to my mind, having been born about 130 miles east of here in Whitewater, Wisconsin, strikes me as an Easterner, but someone who learned sort of hesitantly to move west. He paused for a while in my hometown to be a studio assistant before his family moved all the way, or before he and his family moved to Seattle. And he seemed to have been wrapped up into the idea of the West through his photography. Curtis lived largely in Seattle, but once he embarked on the North American Indian Project, I think he became very deeply enmeshed in the idea of the West. But I find myself wrestling with the notion of whether he was truly interested in the West or if he was truly interested in something a little bit more mythic, a little bit more about the culture of the United States and the transition from a space of unbounded exploration into a space that was more controlled by commercial interests. And certainly he was at a period of time at the turn of the century where this transition was very much in evidence. So how do you picture the West? Well, this is one example of the later life of a great American photographer named William Henry Jackson. This is and I wanted to give you a couple of photographers whose lives intersect with Curtis and with Mark James, just to give you a sense of the nature of photography prior to and during those careers, and also give you a sense of the intersection of art and documentary, of personal statements and the preoccupation with facts. So this is an image of the William Henry Jackson, oh sorry, yeah, okay, we're there. You're ahead of me, oh my gosh. William Henry Jackson was an Easterner, born in New York State in 1843, died in 1942 in New York. But he did come frequently to the West, largely as a kind of hired gun, if it were. In 1870, he came with the Hayden Survey Expedition, and his photographs of Yellowstone and the West were some of the initial material that went into the founding of the U.S. Geological Survey. This image is of one of Jackson's assistants sitting in the California Special, which was a railroad car on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western line. Jackson toured the Southwest in this car in 1902, and the pictures that you see around the assistant are images of Jackson's that basically made this into a kind of a rail-bound gallery, a workshop on wheels, if you will. He was working at this point in his career for the Detroit Publishing Company, and a very significant commercial enterprise had developed using his photographs.
Are all those pictures in Yosemite?
They're Yosemite and the West. The work that he had done around the West, creating a gallery, if you will, of images of the West. But this is the later Jackson. We'll flip to the next one. This is the earlier Jackson. This is how some 30 years earlier Jackson's photographic enterprise looked as he moved through what became Yellowstone National Park. This is again 1872, and you can see the kit on the donkey next to him. That was how you made photographs in those days. You may be aware that when Jackson was photographing, he was using glass plates, which were coated with light-sensitive material, and then exposed, and then they had to be processed before the material dried. It's referred to as the wet collodion process. And in order to do this, you had to have a light, tight environment. So carrying on that burro, that mule, are all the materials that he needed to well, first there are plates that hopefully didn't get broken while you were up there, glass plates. Then there is all of the material for the emulsion. And then there's also a tent, obviously, that you need to use to keep everything light tight. And you have to have this right by where you're photographing. So a wet plate goes into a negative holder, into the camera, out of the camera, back into the tent, and into developing solution. It's really kind of mind-boggling when you think about the effort that it took and that someone like Jackson had to undergo to grab pictures. As you may or may not have seen upstairs, the technology that Mark James was using was considerably more portable, if you will. The pinhole camera and sometimes the larger 8x10 view camera, but the pinhole, I think, is wonderfully transportable. You really didn't need a mule to bring it with you. All right. Next. And this is the kind of picture that Jackson was most noted for. At least in the 1870s and 1878, when this picture was made, Jackson was, as I said, under the auspices of the U.S. Geological Survey, he accumulated a body of evidence, and evidence that, when brought back to Washington, D.C., was so astonishing to legislators. They thought that it was a fiction. They thought, this is something that exists on this continent? And photography at that point was seen as having the ultimate quality of truth. And the fact that there were men standing on top of this was not a photoshopped moment. That wasn't really a reality at that point in time. And so the idea that there was a space in the Western landscape that looked like this made a lot of people really curious and led to the preservation of Yellowstone as a national park, and really opened up the idea of there being a national park in the United States. To preserve wonders like this. I mean, and it was probably quite a few years until people started regularly going to see Yellowstone and to see the geysers and the cones and the stinky mud fields that we've all been able to just drive through now. But it was really quite astonishing. So what Jackson was making were not necessarily the most beautiful pictures, but they were both revelatory and persuasive. Most of you probably recognize this guy. Ansel Adams, yes. Adams was born in 1902 in San Francisco and died in 1984 in Monterey, California. He is a Westerner, born and bred, imbued with the idea of the West as a picturesque landscape worth saving and worth admiring for its inherent beauty. Many people think of Adams as the quintessential photographer of the West. He, don't know if you can see it here, he was famous for his broken nose, which he says happened in the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. A piece of concrete fell and changed his visage forever. Adams here is shown about 4 years before his death in his home in Monterey. He's standing next to a massive enlargement of one of his most familiar images, an image called Monolith in Yosemite, Monolith Half Dome, 1927. And this image represents a lot of what we think about when we think about the classic Western landscape. The image made with a large format camera, an incredible amount of detail, drama, dramatic light, and a scale that is so overwhelming as to almost put you at the base of this mountain. And it's, as I say, it's one of the signature images of Adams's career. But it's also important to acknowledge that this is not the whole truth of Ansel Adams. He had a history that was somewhat murkier. We'll flip to the next. Oh, more your text here. This is a little selection of Adams's work in a sequence for his first portfolio that he produced. The name of the portfolio was the Parmelian Prints of the High Sierras. It was published in 1927, which, if you think about it for a moment, is within the scope of the Curtis Project, which extended until 1930. So Adams published this portfolio. He met an arts patron named Albert Bender and accepted Bender's help to publish this portfolio. Adams also accepted Bender's suggestion to call them Parmelian prints. Now, Parmelian, this is the only place this word has ever appeared in the history of photography and words. It was a completely made-up expression, but Bender felt that the label of photographic prints would not allow them to be taken seriously as art. Bender immediately committed the money to purchase 10 portfolios priced at $50 each. Then he got on the phone and sold 56 others to his friends before lunch. Quite a persuasive fellow. Adams had not even begun working on the prints. Ultimately, he produced a set of 18 photographs. They were gelatin silver prints printed on Kodak Vitava Athena grade T parchment. But no matter what they were called, the prints were undoubtedly a spectacular success. I would mention too that that $50 figure for the portfolio. Anyone want to guess what a portfolio of these prints went for in the 2000s? $1 million? No, under 100,000. Yep. The Parmelian prints, I think the high water mark that I've been able to find is $97,000 at Christie's in 2008. I mean, relatively, there have been some sales and estimates for this portfolio that are quite affordable in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. There are some interesting elements to this, but the one thing I wanted to mention, and you can see Monolith on the left, these prints were about 4 by 6 inches, in contrast to the image, the monolithic, grand, iconic image that we saw of Adams a page or two before. So, and when I say murky, I mean that these are prints that were printed for the purpose of expression, for the purpose not of fact, but of space and expression and something a little bit more along the lines of the picturesque. Pictorialism is one of the things that is a photographic school of soft focus and sort of more subtle tonalities that arose out of an interest in having photography be more like something that wasn't photography, like painting, printmaking, more accepted forms of art. So Bender was, maybe a little extreme in creating a new name for printmaking, but it was, it was strategic, and it seems to have had a positive effect. So we're going to enter Curtis now. Curtis, as I said, born in 1863, an uneasy convert to the web. I mean, to the West, not the web. He certainly wasn't interested in the web. At least I would hope that he was. An uneasy convert. And you all know about Curtis, so I'm just going to go ahead to the next image and show you. Oh, we can flip forward, David. Oh, this is really hard to see here, but I like the fact that Mark James, who is the artist on the right, managed to look as much as he could like Curtis here. All right. So let's go to the next. Yep. Nope, that's meant to be there. I wanted to give you all an idea of how I first encountered this exhibition. It was really kind of fun to open this up and realize that I was not looking at a familiar set of Curtis work here. The show upstairs makes reference to the immediately recognizable style of Edward Curtis, and you may be among the only people in the whole Curtis world for whom these landscapes would be immediately recognizable. In my experience, Curtis has always looked like something else. I mean, I recognize the landscapes as being his, but I've been most often clued into Curtis as a slightly different type of photographer. So, and I would like to commend Stacy, who I've not had a pleasure of meeting, but I think she did a really remarkable job in putting this show together. Let's go to the next.
And is that partly due to the fact that the portraits are seen so much more than the landscapes?
Yep. I mean, look at your own history in showing the collection suggests this as well. I think there were 4 or 5, 6 of those shows that were about particular faces, portraits, mothers and children, warriors. This one I kind of like because it shows Mark James on the right as being a little bit more like the William Henry Jackson out on the mountaintop, not so much stuck in the studio as Curtis was. And James, I should say, is a real Westerner. I think of him as, you know, someone who was born and raised in the West, still lives in the mountains, talks about, oh yeah, I'm sorry I wasn't able to get back to you yesterday, I was hiking. You know, so fully immersed in life in the mountains. Next, please. The portrait on the right is what I more typically think of as a Curtis. And you can see how the self-portrait of the man on the left could be seen to be echoed in the portrait on the right, a sort of handsome, visionary quality. I love that the gaze of the man on the right is going off screen as though he's looking for something that we aren't going to be able to see. The next picture I think is quite intriguing. I love the fact that on the right we have the expression of someone who is really regarding us. This is not someone who's trying to avoid our gaze. This is someone who is giving back to us, and well, through Curtis, both a kind of whimsy and a skepticism, maybe pain. It's possible to read so many things into that face, which were not present in the image previous. So anyway, I love to see this evolution of the Curtis imagery. But what you have in the show here is something a little bit different, and I think it's a remarkable change of pace. Next. What we see here in this show, and maybe a little difficult to see in the slide, but it's upstairs, are pictures of everyday life. You have images that are clearly not made in a studio, images that reflect some of the behaviors and interests and craft work of the American Indians. And I find it quite refreshing to be able to see this contextual work and have a sense that this is not Curtis operating in a fictive mode. The images of the gentleman before really feel to me as though they've been made up somehow. They have truth to them, a kind of truthiness, to quote Stephen Colbert, but they don't feel real to me. These images, and we'll go to the next one, have a sense of being part of the ritual, the practice of daily life. This is an image I want to look at more closely upstairs because the Mark James picture that it's paired with, I think, is one of the most beautiful and telling pairings in the show. But I just, I can't imagine that something like this has been set up. It's not been rigged to reflect some preconceived notion of what the photographer was after. Next. In an image like this, I feel like we're going a little bit back towards the notion of pictorialism, the idea of big areas of sort of soft focus, and a kind of iconic scene with the built-in ideas of reflection and shadow. And what I find one of the most interesting things about the last three pictures is that we're looking at people who are looking away. We're looking at people who are not confronting the camera. The photographer, Curtis, has chosen to present images of people who are looking back, looking deep into space, away from us. And this is consistent with a mentality that Curtis was expressing of the idea of the vanishing race. Curtis was operating with the support of Teddy Roosevelt, who introduced him to J.P. Morgan. And Morgan underwrote Curtis's field work to the tune of about $75,000 to work in this space of the American West and to come to some understanding of what the American Indian situation was, and could we not prove to some degree that the Indians were a dying race, that we could be justified in moving west and taking over this land. Curtis, I think, proved otherwise, maybe despite his own best interests, but I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that the Indian culture was maintaining itself quite well. Next. Oh, and this is almost impossible to see. Do you all know what the orotone is? Yes? No? All right. The Curtis orotone, and we can go to the next one, was a really splendid work of visual art. It took a regular print of his and backed it, a print on glass, a positive print on glass, and backed it with gold particles that were embedded in oil and applied to the back of that piece of glass. So there's truly, these are gilt images. And I say that maybe with two meanings, but really just G-I-L-T. And framed in a very elaborate way. And this is a little bit large. I mean, this is a serious piece of art. It's about 11 by 17 inches. And this was, perhaps the most beautiful example in Curtis's production of a collectible work. And the image put forward here is plate number 1 from volume number 1 of his magnum opus. And it's acquired the title of The Vanishing Race. And if this was a little bit clearer, you could see a line of horses moving into a dark, shadowy space defined by mountains in the background. Everyone facing away, basically a scene moving into darkness. And the entire image cast in gold, as though this was some burnished memory, fact becoming fiction, present becoming the past. Next. Now, I would love to say that this was actually Curtis's quote, but this is Mark James, who we exchanged a few messages, and I asked him about his interest, sort of how his art and vision came about. And as I was reading this, I thought, wow, this sounds a little bit like Curtis. This reminds me a little bit of everything that I'd been reading about Curtis and what I'd been seeing in the photographs, even in this orotone. Oro, of course, being the root for gold, so gold tone photograph. So yeah, the limited tonal scale, long exposures, gossamer water features, dark landforms, and lots of haze whenever possible. I thought that was, an interesting thing for him to be after, because he's a 20th century, now 21st century artist. Go ahead. And you know, this embodies a lot of what Mark James is talking about, but we've seen that there's a very different goal in mind for his work. Next. And just to come back to, I can't get enough of this comparison, and I, you know, am really taken by how Curtis is in that dark space. He's just barely emerging from the brim of his hat, and in contrast, the sitter on the right has a classically modeled, what we would even call Rembrandt lighting to his face, and the eyes are so open in one regard, and so also conflicted maybe. Well, that might be reading too much, but the idea that there's a bemusement, a bit of loss, a bit of irony, but a really challenging and intelligent return gaze, which I find extends also into this version, another version of the Mark James portrait, where he's got this very open, quizzical, again, bemused, but intensely observant expression on his face. Next. The idea of landscape, of making a landscape, is one of the things that I find most challenging when I think about photography, because the land is just sitting there. You know, it's just there. You have to, and as a photographer, you have to take a certain, you have to be a little bit arrogant. You have to say, my view of this is important. My view of this is going to mean something just because I did it, just because I put that camera frame around that space. But the crucial fact of the landscapes that I think are the landscapes in the show are that they reflect literally the hand of the artist. In Curtis's work, we see ritual, we see his subjects doing what they do in their real everyday life, as opposed to in the studio life that he created for so many. And in Mark James's work, we see a kind of hands-on photographic articulation, a language that relies on the artist's ability to bring his own presence, his own aesthetic choices into the landscape. So I think that between the two of them, between James and Curtis, we have a wonderful synthesis of attitudes about nature, about artists and their role in interpreting nature, and comparisons that I would love to explore at greater length upstairs. So I'm happy to stop at this point. I think there may be one more slide that says thanks. And hang on, just wanted to thank David and Margie and I'm sorry, and Stacy for the great work that she did. And I really want to commend Dubuque on its patrons' commitment to maintaining, keeping this portfolio intact and as part of an important collection. So my thanks to the community at large for giving the same attention to an amazing body of photographs as you have for Grant Wood, and one of my favorite illustrators of all time, having been a father of 4 children, Arthur Geisert, just so close to my heart. So I feel we may or may not be in the West, but I have a wonderful sense of compassion and connection with you all from upriver. Oh, and I also wanted to thank, I don't know if anyone here knows Wenzel Towing and Repair. I managed to leave my wife's car's headlights on overnight, and Wenzel came and bailed me out. So if any of you know them, please thank them for me. All right, thanks so much. And this is where my expertise falls short, but my guess is that Curtis probably shared some of his thoughts about what he was interested in. He had about 8 years earlier, he had made his first portrait of an American Indian, an ancient woman who was a chief's daughter or something, but she looked like she was about 120 years old in the photograph. And so this idea had been percolating for Curtis. And I'm guessing that when that portrait was done in 1904, Roosevelt saw an opportunity to connect with perhaps the most wealthy man of that period of time, J. Pierpont Morgan. And Morgan liked the idea. I'm not sure he really understood what Curtis was going after, but he did commit the $75,000 to be dispersed over a 5-year period. And he said that it was just for the field work. But Curtis had a pretty big imagination. Curtis actually spent close to 20 years doing field work. He never took the $75,000 never went to salary for him. It went to travel. It was not supposed to be used for publishing the book. I'm sure it probably went, to a certain number of meals for the Curtis family. But he basically impoverished himself over the period between 1907 and 1930, when the book, the series was finally done. When it was completed, the North American Indian set was 20 volumes, 2 sets of 20 volumes, one set of texts and the other of hand-pulled photogravures, the illustrations. And there were in the neighborhood of 1,500 photogravures produced for the book, and there were, I think it's about 220. The edition of the book was in 220, so multiply 220 times 1,500. These are the gravures, and he did them all himself. There's a phrase, hand-pulled, which is literally him putting paper under a press, pulling it out after the impression's been made. So this is a man who was on a vision quest, I guess you might say. By 1928, he had basically bankrupted himself and went back to Morgan. And Morgan, of course, hadn't, he had come out of the deal with, I think he had arranged to have 25 copies of the finished product and 500 prints outside of the gravures. So he was doing okay from the very outset. And in 1928, Curtis went back to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Morgan, I'm broke. What can I do?" And he ended up selling Morgan the rights, the reproduction rights, the whole kit and caboodle. And that, I think, enabled him to, finally close out some of his debts and make it to California, where he, more or less reluctantly, I think, or maybe out of necessity, became a cinematographer and a Hollywood photographer, which is ironic given his casting, if you will, of Indians from various tribes in roles that had been capsulated, carried from a different place in time into the studio. So I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, he was an ethnographic filmmaker, but he also, was involved in more conventional Hollywood productions. But the set of the North American Indian is quite a remarkable accomplishment. Things that Morgan did was take those 50 copies that he had and kind of resell them to people, his friends. So he was the businessman. And Curtis was the appetite.
How much was one of the whole sets? At that time?
Gosh, I'm not sure. It was I really don't even want to pull a figure out.
Great question.
Yeah. Well, I remember reading an article that said that it was the equivalent of the cost of a mansion.
Were also intended to be in a edition about twice the size that they ended up as. I think even Adams ran out of steam and then lost quite a bit of the material in a fire. So the Parmelian Prince portfolio is an odd duck. I think it was intended to be in an edition of 150. Fewer than 70 ended up being produced. Not all the prints are signed. They're all clearly of a piece, but somehow the project kind of fell apart. And I don't think it's anywhere near as interesting and significant as the North American Indian. I'm not sure that any series of books produced in the United States over the last 2 centuries has the kind of value and weight that the Curtis Project does. Yeah, Randy.
Why didn't he involve apprentices in doing those quarterly birds? I mean,
He did. Yeah. I think he recognized some of his own limitations and did employ researchers probably more than studio assistants because there was a huge amount of text. I mean, the text volumes are like this, and the gravures are about half that size. So the amount of material that needed to be produced for those sections required a lot of help, a lot of editorial assistance. I think Curtis was just driven. I mean, I think he just found it critical that he be the person to do that work. Yep.
I read that he also made movies and did sound recordings.
Opera.
Yep.
Did that?
Some 1,000 wax cylinder recordings of.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, he was a zealot. What do we call it? I mean, someone who was committed to the documentation of this vanishing race. I mean, given the amount of material that he alone has put into it, it's not vanishing. I mean, we know that.
Did any of those materials go along with the volumes? Or?
No. I would imagine that they served as references, resource material, but those are separate. Those are in the collection of the Library of Congress, I believe. And his ethnographic filmmaking is a parallel track, but clearly you couldn't make a DVD and stick it in the back of volume 20 of the North American Indian at the time. Anything else? All right, well, let's go upstairs. I just